Like movies? Listen to the 430 Movie, available wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can visit us at 430movie.com. Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
And this is Darren Doctorman, and we are
The Inglorious Trexperts.
Welcome.
We're here with our regular Trexperts who are once again joining us, and we're thrilled to have them. Mr. Robert Meyer Burnett.
It's great to be here. Great to be here.
And Ashley Edward Miller.
I'm so excited, and I cannot hide it.
Of course, you know Rob Burnett as the director, editor, and co-writer of Free Enterprise, which will be celebrating its 20th anniversary next year. And it's hard to believe, but we're old. And then Ashley Miller has Lore, which just dropped on Amazon, and you should check it out. He's also the writer for the upcoming Red Sonja, which will be coming to theaters sometime in the future. Where we all spend the rest of our lives. And, well, guys, today we're going back to the beginning, where it all started. It was
Back in the before time.
The Lieutenant.
Yes, we're going to talk about the Lieutenant. No,
That's right.
We're actually going to, although that is relevant because a lot of the relationships that Gene Roddenberry brought to bear on the Cage started on the Lieutenant. Of course, we're talking about the original Star Trek pilot, The Cage, which in the way, not only provided the foundation, the DNA for what became Star Trek, but to this day is really the bedrock on which Star Trek in all its incarnations is built on. The more Star Trek has changed, the more it stayed the same. And when you look at The Cage, you realize how much even contemporary Star Trek owes to the template that was set by The Cage those many years ago.
And it's interesting as we talk about this more. I hope to make everyone understand that it's the relationship to The Cage that makes modern Star Trek to me less enticing.
How so? Can you expand on that?
The Cage, at least how Roddenberry spun it, the network's reaction to The Cage was that it was too cerebral, too deep science fiction of a story, and that none of the actors were particularly engaging.
Well, it's interesting when we look at The Cage to take a step back. Gene Roddenberry, as many of you know, was a war veteran where he flew during World War II. He later wrote speeches for the chief of police of Los Angeles, William Parker, which could have been a TV show in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. And I think he tried to make it a TV show a couple times.
And then he sold to MGM a show called The Lieutenant. This was shortly after he was a writer on many different shows, but most notably, he met the showrunner and creator of Have Gun Will Travel, Sam Rolfe. Mm-hmm. And Have Gun Will Travel in many ways has some eerie parallels with The Cage. Even though it's a Western,
right. It
revolves around a character played by Richard Boone called Paladin. And he's really one of the more fascinating characters in television history. This was a guy, every episode would generally start in San Francisco, where he was a bon vivant who was as comfortable with the latest, ordering wine and quoting Shakespeare and Yeats as he was when he would receive a wire that he was needed as a mercenary, generally, gun for hire, have gun, will travel, wire, Paladin, San Francisco, and would go off on these adventures, now dressed completely in black on his horse, and could fight and shoot, and was total badass gun for hire. And it was a complete counterpoint to his life as basically a dandy in San Francisco.
He was basically Iron Man.
It was a remarkable character, and it was one of the few shows at the time in which the Native Americans were not depicted as evil. Mm-hmm. Often, it would depict racism and basically, Paladin would often expose the idiocy and the foolishness of sort of racism and sexism and other such vices. And it is an extremely literate series. It's extremely entertaining. And Paladin, at his heart, was sort of a combination of the passion of Kirk, the conscience of McCoy, and the intelligence of Spock.
Mm-hmm.
And if you see many of the episodes written by Gene, you will see a lot of the staples of Star Trek reflected in his episodes, including the name Robert April, which first appeared in an episode of Have Gun Will Travel. I can't say enough good things about the show. Maybe one time we'll actually do an episode on Have Gun Will Travel, because if not us, who? But I strongly recommend that so much of what you found in The Cage. And then, of course, Gene goes on. He has an idea for a show that involves a cruise ship, in which the cruise ship is a character. The ship is a character, much as the Enterprise would become.
Sort of like the Love Boat?
And then, very much like it was a precursor to Love Boat. And of course,
Herbie the Love Boat.
He comes up with after seeing Vincent Price and Master of the World, comes up with a show set in Victorian times of a dirigible traveling through, going on adventures. Right. Also a precursor to Star Trek, which never sold. But ultimately, it's The Cage, which we remember, which endears ourselves, which is now legend. Let's talk about The Cage.
Well, the thing is that throughout Roddenberry's early career in writing scripts, he got so many network notes that were basically keeping him from dealing with objectionable subjects, perhaps, or strange characters that they didn't think that the audience would agree to, or various notes that would just stop his creativity. And
what was the key to that, Darren? The key was an episode of Lieutenant, which he did one season of, which Nichelle Nichols was in, called "To Set It Right" with Dennis Hopper. And in this episode of The Lieutenant, it dealt with racism in the armed forces. At which point, the network aired it but canceled the show and this was the first example of Roddenberry really being Roddenberry, because they weren't going to air it. It's much like what happened with Blackish recently. Right. And Roddenberry got the NAACP involved, who thought it was important, and they guilted the network into doing it. But the network was so pissed at Roddenberry for being manipulated, and the armed forces were no longer going to let them film at Camp Pendleton because they felt that it was misrepresenting racism in the military.
So Roddenberry thought for a second, and he thought something like this. Back in the early days when I was reading stories by Jonathan Swift, the stories about Gulliver and his adventures, Jonathan Swift would take current political situations and he would couch them in these fantastical environments. And he would trick people into reading stories about things that directly related to them. But because it was happening to tiny people or gigantic people, they wouldn't understand that it was actually about them. And that is what he says his pattern was for coming up with Star Trek. That if you could talk about racism or bigotry or hatred from the point of view of a little green man, then perhaps he could get it past the censors and the networks, and that's what his objective was.
Yeah, what were some of the scripts that were in contention for the pilot? You guys remember?
Well, you wrote the book, The 50-Year Mission.
Yeah.
He had obviously the one that he wrote was the Menagerie, then later changed to The Cage.
Yep. Because menagerie was a difficult word to understand.
Right.
Much like license revoked became license to kill.
That's right.
Revoked, very difficult word.
So, it became, I love that, it's sort of like changing something like City on the Edge of Forever to The City,
Right. That would have been the episode if it had been on Voyager.
Exactly.
Now, I know there were other scripts in contention for the second pilot, which were Mud's Women and the Omega Glory. Were those in play for The Cage as well?
Yeah, because Oscar Katz tells the story about how, they presented a number of pitches, and one of them was the idea that it was in fact Wagon Train, and that there was a woman who was away from Earth, who was having problems away from home. She's the guest star. The captain, helps her work through these problems. And at the end, we never see her again. But there were a variety of different shows. But the reason that they chose The Cage was because it was the most complicated show, and they figured if they could pull off The Cage, they could pull off anything they were pitching them.
Right.
Because they talked a good game, Oscar Katz, Herb Solow, Gene Roddenberry, but
they wanted to see if they could.
But they wanted to see. But I think I can do it.
Here among a billion stars, a lonely ship streaks along an endless path. It's the mammoth starship Enterprise. Follow her trackless journey each week on Star Trek. William Shatner stars as Captain James Kirk, Starship Commander, and Leonard Nimoy stars as Science Officer Spock, half Earthling, half Vulcanian. There are hazards that beset the Enterprise and its crew on board ship and on alien planets. Don't miss Star Trek in color.
So they wanted to see if they could do it, and so they chose The Cage, which was obviously a very difficult show to pull off, particularly in that time, given the state of special effects. You got to remember, it was before 2001. I mean, the state of the art was the Jupiter 2 and Lost in Space.
Yeah, and that was a lot of the atmosphere that Roddenberry was combating against. I mean, that's one of the reasons why CBS didn't pick up Star Trek, because, well, we already have a sci-fi show. We have Lost in Space. So
see how that worked out for
Yeah.
him.
Yeah. Well, they were inventing the wheel. I mean, they were really inventing the wheel. Not only with visual effects, but in terms of makeup effects, in terms of casting, the role of women. Because, of course, obviously the stories of, later on about Gene being very sexist and all that, that has been chronicled in many gossipy tomes. But the reality is, creating this role for Majel, who, yes, was his girlfriend at the time, but creating a role where she was second in command and really a force of nature and completely empowered, strong, unemotional.
She was basically Spock.
right.
She was basically Spock. And, when you look at the depiction of women at the time who, were basically either mothers or secretaries or, if
Or
they
arm
were
candy.
or arm candy, this was an incredible leap forward. And as such to the point that, ultimately she didn't make it past the first pilot because it was so ambitious or ahead of its time.
Certainly Roddenberry spun the story about that into the fact that they couldn't believe that a woman would be in that role. He certainly went that way.
You
in
talk
the
to
late
others,
70s.
and there's certainly a feeling that they didn't think Majel was particularly good, and that they resented the fact that he cast his girlfriend. He was trying to keep that to himself and not let them. But also he sort of had to sacrifice a character on the altar, and was it going to be Spock or was it going to be number one?
So I decided to keep the Vulcan and marry the woman. It was his line that he would say. But I think it's interesting because, honestly, I don't think number one comes across very well in the episode.
She's not served well.
She's not served well because she's not
jealous.
written well.
Yeah. She doesn't truly have a lot to do.
Right.
Spock would always provide he was, I don't know if he was the angel or the devil on Kirk's shoulder, but he was one of them.
Right.
He was kind of devilish.
Yeah, he was.
Because you look at him in
kinda.
Mud's Women, when he's perving out on the women as they, walk out of the transporter room, and he's like looking at, sort of that hubba look over at Kirk and McCoy and everything, and it's like that is not the Spock that we came to know and love later on.
It's really not. But Spock, his function on the show became. He was a foil for Kirk. And number one wasn't really a foil for Pike.
That's true.
So she didn't really she had a characterization, but what she didn't have truly was a character. And now, in fairness, that was a pilot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it wasn't about her.
Right.
But I'm very, I'm hip to your groove on this one.
But I will say that I do feel that there were, before we talk about so much that was great about it, along the lines of what you're saying, there were some conceptual mistakes in the sense that, they did play this great arc where Pike was carrying the weariness of command on his shoulders, and the only person he could confide in was the ship's doctor, played by John Hoyt. Now, by going with a much older character actor, it didn't really give him a contemporary in the way that Shatner and D. Kelly would later, or Shatner and Nimoy would play their scenes. And so it gave it a paternal relationship. And I don't think that necessarily served it well, even though I do like the scene where he confesses to John Hoyt, maybe I don't want to be captain. It's the same arc that didn't work in Star Trek Beyond, where he's tired of being in space and doesn't want to be captain. Like for Pike, it's great because it's really one episode, but you want the captain of your ship to actually be Hornblower and want to embrace.
Especially in those days when television shows were about more or less heroes, right? And you didn't want to have an angst-ridden, internalizing main character. You couldn't readily identify with him.
And I liked that about Pike. I found that really interesting, and maybe it was also I liked Jeffrey Hunter's performance in that, and it's certainly Star Trek comes back to it in Balance of Terror. I mean, there's an obvious line kind of between those two characters and between Kirk and Pike, and at least the sentiment that they're expressing and the emotions that they're going through, if not the specific scenario.
Well, Ira Behr says something I think very insightful in my book, 50 Year Mission, where he says, what you forget now, what Jeffrey Hunter brought to bear at the time was he was a movie star.
Right.
He was in The Longest Day. He was in, obviously, The Searchers. So you knew Jeffrey Hunter, and he was like a matinee idol. He was a really good-looking guy, right? And so he brings something very different to what Shatner did, because even though Shatner had been on these shows, he was on these failed TV shows. Right. He had a small role in Judgment in Nuremberg. He wasn't a household name the way that Jeffrey Hunter was. I mean, Jeffrey Hunter's like, if you're doing True Detective 1966, you'd put Jeffrey Hunter in it, right?
Right.
So it's very interesting because look at the other people that they were looking to cast. Lloyd Bridges, who'd just come off a successful run on Sequest, who said he didn't want to go anywhere near science fiction. Leslie Nielsen, right?
Right.
Who were some of the other people? Jack Lord. They couldn't come to financial terms with him. He wanted too much money.
Good Lord. Can you imagine?
Good Lord. Yeah.
Can you imagine Star Trek with Jack Lord? I mean,
yes.
I don't know, man. Book him, Spock.
You know what? I think is where the Cage actually benefited was the perception of science fiction in media had begun to change in the late 50s. Obviously, you had Forbidden Planet, which is clearly a template for Star Trek. Mm-hmm. You had The Twilight Zone on television, which was written by a fairly, not just Rod Serling, but all the other esteemed writers that had come on board. And you were looking towards Star Trek or science fiction novelists or playwrights or things like that. But those were that was an anthology format, and then you had the Outer Limits as well. That Star Trek was sort of going to be the first weekly television show that wasn't an anthology, that was going to be a prestige show. Mm-hmm. It wasn't going to be Rocky Jones Space Ranger or something like that. Mm-hmm. It was an attempt to do a thoughtful. It was conceived of as being a thoughtful, meaningful program that could compete.
To de-kiddify it.
They would have pitched it as premium cable.
Right. And I think that was very interesting, and the parallels between Roddenberry had to have looked at Forbidden Planet because there's so many, the crew of a ship that's ongoing.
You can just look at it. He was taking notes, I think.
Right, and that was, and what was Forbidden Planet? But it was a Shakespeare adaptation of The Tempest. So it showed that I think Roddenberry in his mind was looking towards, which is why so many Star Trek writers were novelists and playwrights and poached indeed from Twilight Zone or these other prestige genre programs.
One little note about Hunter's performance. It's interesting that the reason why we have this loud, shouty, emotional Spock is because of Hunter's portrayal. Hunter's internalization meant that Nimoy, as an actor, couldn't go the same direction that Hunter was. And so Spock had to be different, had to make his character different.
He had to be at full intensity.
Yes, correct.
The women!
The women! I mean, as we look at it now, it seems comical. But at the time, it is a valid thing. If you're playing A, I can't play A. I have to play
if
B.
you don't have the benefit of knowing where this character is going to go,
Right.
then yes, it totally makes sense against Jeffrey Hunter. Whereas against Shatner, you can't out histrionic Shatner.
Exactly.
So he needs to underplay it, which he obviously learned very early. And Scott Mantz, the critic, the film critic, TV critic, makes a really good point. He said Shatner emerged in the role fully formed.
Right.
Shatner played Kirk the same way from the first episode.
From line one.
Yeah, from the moment he shows up in Where No Man Has Gone Before, it never changes. You know, it gets a little broader by the time you get to the movies because he's become an icon.
Right.
You know, but it never really evolves in a great way because it's so fully formed. Whereas Nimoy needed to find that character over time, and over that first season, you really see that character evolving until he finally settles into what that role is. And then we talked about D. Kelly. The thing is, Gene, to his credit, wanted to hire D. Kelly from the outset. It was Robert Butler, the director, who talked him out of it, and then James Goldstone, who talked him out of it again on Where No Man Has Gone Before.
Hiring Paul Fix.
Paul Fix for the role of the Doctor in that, which is equally a bad choice.
Yeah. Well, I have an interesting memo here from Roddenberry it's a letter from Roddenberry to Paul Fix, telling him about the decision.
He's calling you now.
Yeah, talking about the decision to let Paul Fix go and recast, recharacter the role. He says, "Dear Paul, as you probably know by now, Star Trek will be on the air this coming September. Due to changes in format, budget structure, and character concepts, we cannot pick up a number of options, including yours. But we do hope that Dr. Piper will reappear in future stories and hope we will be fortunate enough to find you interested and available at that time. Let me thank you for your important contribution in the making of the Star Trek pilot. As mentioned many times before, I value your talent and ability highly, and it will always be a particular pleasure for me when we are able to work together. Cordially yours, Gene Roddenberry." Well, that's a pretty good "you're fired" note.
Yeah. I'm still waiting for that reappearance. Right?
You know, I think another thing that I found always interesting, even as a kid, when I first learned about the Cage and the difference between the Cage and the Menagerie and all that, was the fact that story begins after the Enterprise has had a great tragedy.
Right.
You're coming off of the mission to Rigel, which was the week before, a couple weeks ago. Pike has lost men, not just one or two, but like 6 people.
It was a rout.
It was, they got their asses handed to them, and he's in the midst of feeling guilt, and he's recriminations, and could he have done something better? And I always thought that was a really interesting choice for your pilot. You're coming off of
You're on the downslope.
You are on the downslope, and for guys who had fought in World War II and like Gene Roddenberry, that they had lost battles. You know, and that's where Star Trek began, was sort of at a place of demoralization. And I've always thought that was an interesting way to go, especially for a pilot of a show of this kind.
Well, it immediately opens up the world. It immediately it sets you in the middle of this story, and you're hearing about stuff that happened last week, but you haven't seen last week.
But that's such a great point about, having gone through the war, that he would be, and I never thought about it like that. It would just be about something they don't really talk about that much, but that you feel that he's still suffering from the weight of losing these boys under his command. And it's very subtle, but it's immensely effective because, of course, now we think about the Viking and, him protecting Vina, when we lose sight of what that Rigel battle must have been, that beautiful matte painting. But that's really interesting to consider.
It's echoed in Balance of Terror when Kirk is asking himself, why me?
Right.
And there's that great, I'm sure this came out of the military experience of not just Roddenberry, but others that had worked on the show. And I always felt like in the first season of Star Trek, there's definitely this element of these are seasoned professionals that have seen some bad along with the good they're doing in the universe. And I think that was definitely something that was it might not have been overt, but it was in the DNA of the program.
Well, it's something that's very different between, I think, the writers of the original series, and particularly Roddenberry, and then what's happened later, even in Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, that those writers and those directors had actually they had been soldiers and airmen. They had been sailors. They had been cops. They had seen these things and experienced these things in a real way. And one of the things that has happened in television has just been you have cop shows, written by people who have never worn a badge, or people writing about, and this is different now because we've, obviously there are a lot of veterans who are now kind of getting out into this industry, but you had people writing about the things they had seen other people write about,
Right.
and it was very
you
authentic.
have the danger of cop shows being written by people who have watched cop shows.
Yes, exactly.
It's so interesting because I feel like with The Cage, also Roddenberry doesn't get the credit he deserves because if you look at the Irwin Allen shows, it's a flying saucer. It's with Family Robinson in space. What Roddenberry did was he really tried to portray a realistic view of the future. He brought in his cousin Harvey Lin from the Rand Company to help come up with concepts. And if you look at these early memos, constantly he's going back to what's realistic. He postulates the idea of a giant computer brain that controls the Enterprise, and maybe we're not leaning into that enough, and how it would show us where our missions are and where we're going. And I mean, this is long before. This is when computers filled giant. They were punch cards, and they filled giant rooms. And he had the idea of Siri. And
Right.
Wikipedia. I mean, and this is 1966, and it's remarkable. And what felt like such forward thinking at the time was then people look back and say, "Oh, it's dated and silly." Is remarkably prescient.
And then 20 years later, it would sound exactly like his wife.
Yes, that's right. Go figure. Yeah. And there was always a role for Majel. And, and that's the case with so many things, whether it be the communicators, which, presaged mobile phones. You talked about that. But even sliding doors. Now we look at it like, I don't know, whatever. But at the time, grocery stores didn't have sliding doors, things we take for granted. So really, when you say that Roddenberry was a futurist, and we talked a little bit about also anticipating social media and how to manipulate the crowd. He was the original, in a way, before there was a Facebook, he knew how to manipulate the fans into doing his bidding to get what he wanted. And that was pretty remarkable. And I don't say that in a critical way. I say that with great admiration.
But let's also remember that he was also a brilliant creative producer. And I say this because the big budget problem that he had was landing the ship on a planet every week. He tried to figure out a way to make that economical, and he couldn't until he realized one thing. What if we had a device that could magically transport our characters down to the planet? We don't have to land. We don't have to do anything. We can just get them in, get them down, and get on with the story. And he came up with the transporter based on saving money. And I think that's absolutely brilliant.
Well, but what's so interesting about that?
Signature technology.
Yeah. But it also is, other than warp speed, it's kind of the one thing that hasn't happened yet, or probably will never happen, because unlike other things, it came out of a story need. It came out of a budgetary need. So it wasn't created based on real science. It was created based on
no money.
A narrative need and a financial impetus. Whereas a lot of this other stuff came out of real research and anticipating future trends and where things were going and the advice of scientists who he engaged in, later people like Isaac Asimov and stuff like that. So it's
Although
very
I
interesting.
think sometimes the advice of scientists was there just so he could say that he had the advice of scientists.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I think there was a lot of that being played just for sort of street value.
But, I think when you look at sickbay, a lot of that did come from Harvey Lin, the diagnostic bed and the way that sickbay would work and stuff. So, yeah, I think later on a lot of it, because, I think that by the time you get to Star Trek The Motion Picture and The Wormhole, he's sort of doing a lot of, I got Jessica von Puttermaker here telling me that this is the way it would really happen. And,
Jessica von Puttermaker?
I'm a big fan of his.
I'm sure you mean Jesko von Puttkammer.
Yeah, that guy.
But I like your pronunciation better.
Jessica von
Puttermaker was a killer miniature golf player. Let me tell
And he
you.
also made great peanut butter.
Buttermaker's peanut butter. It's peanut butter by Buttermilk.
Yeah, okay.
It's Star Trek is brought
But
to you by.
let's talk also about the idea that unrestrained power, that could lead to destruction. I mean, what about
The
the
enormous
message?
power of illusion.
Of the Telosians, led to the downfall of their race
Yeah.
when they grew to, power. I mean, it's a sort of childhood end kind of thing.
You mean the Krell?
Well, it is,
Telosians?
yeah. It's basically Forbidden Planet. Yes, okay. So,
But it's even sadder than the Krell. The Telosians didn't destroy themselves.
Right.
They just became useless. They became TV watchers. They became
Twitterers.
yeah. They became a race of non-creators.
if you look at the cage through the lens of today, it's even more powerful,
Yeah.
given the metaphor you've just drawn for us.
Basically, a big metaphor for Facebook. Really.
And it's so funny because I think if you look at a
Delusions
lot
have
of,
posted.
I think if you look at a lot of Star Trek pilots, that their metaphor or that their allegory might be more impactful today. Like at the time, you look at Farpoint in the late '90s, the solar starfish. They were being used by the society, for basically to create power, but we didn't care if we were hurting them. It's like okay, whatever. But now it's like you think about it. Of course, the Trump administration will be like, yeah, well, who cares about global warming? We got these solar starfish to create power, and even though they're sentient beings, we're going to exploit them until they die. It's like
As
it
long as
feels
they
like
hold hands at the end, I think that's the thing that matters.
what?
I just, because
As long as they hold tentacles
hold
at the end.
hands, their little
Yeah,
tentacles.
yeah. But I mean,
great
it's funny
joy.
just because the whole idea of
my God.
animals and a species being wiped out. It feels more relevant in the broader context. Today and than even in 1997, where it felt a little just silly and kind of that whole Farpoint denouement is
silly.
kind of like goofy. I mean, it was funny because the Squire of Gothos ripoff part was much more interesting with Q
Yep.
than the solar starfish. Then you go to something
And
like
that was Dorothy's
Right.
part was the solar starfish, and
Right.
Roddenberry came in and threw in Q.
yeah, so he could get credit on it.
Right.
I mean, it's so funny. He wanted to take an hour show and make it 90 minutes or 2 hours so that he would get the shared credit on the pilot, and came up with, and then ripped off Squire of Gothos.
Yeah.
And
I think this test will be very interesting for my residual check.
But, let's also bring up the fact that after the production of the first pilot, it was basically thrown out. And they made a second pilot, and that's what actually sold the show. But Roddenberry's later use of that first pilot is absolutely brilliant.
Perhaps one of the most brilliant things ever in the history of television,
And-
as far as a production
Yes.
standpoint.
And the fact that in one fell swoop he saves the cost of the pilot and integrates it into the cost of the series, and makes it into a 2-part episode, and expands the universe immediately, showing that this happened 11 years ago.
what Darren is talking about, for those of you who may not know, is, of course, The Cage, the original unaired pilot. At the end of the first season, Star Trek was way over budget and behind schedule, and they needed to do something clever. And Gene Roddenberry conceived the idea to take the Cage pilot and incorporate it into a 2-part episode called The Menagerie, which would serve as flashbacks, not in a Shades of Grey way, where like, whoa, remember when I was injured and we went on this mission? and it was complicated by the fact, of course, that Shatner was not in this pilot. So your series lead, and so much about this pilot didn't fit the aesthetic of the show they were making. So it is an incredible, audacious achievement on Roddenberry's part to have created the Menagerie and find a way to thread the Cage through those 2 episodes. And in fact, that's how we all learned about the Cage, because all we knew was the Menagerie growing up.
Well, actually, because I went to one of those Roddenberry lectures that he did at colleges. I went to one at Kane College in 1976, I think, or maybe it was 75. He showed that original Cage pilot on 16 millimeter, and it was unfreaking believable because I had already seen the Menagerie many times, and seeing these scenes that no one had ever seen before.
I wish there were a few.
Oh my God!
Well, I remember
It
when
was
aired,
amazing.
and he presented it, and he kind of came out. He did his whole
Right.
and this is
On the engine room of the Next
Right.
Generation.
These-
set.
Yeah.
These are sets from some of our Star Trek movies.
Yeah. And I remember just being so excited to see that. Remember, kids, this was back in a time when you didn't just go, wow, The Cage just dropped on Netflix. I think I'll watch it. It was like, I had to make an appointment
To watch it,
To
yeah.
watch
Well,
it.
before that, I'm sure Rob and Darren remember, it came out on home video, and they had not been able to find. They only had the work print,
Right.
So all the footage from The Cage was in black and white,
Right.
and the only stuff was in color was the stuff they took from the Menagerie. So it was years later they ended up finding it, and then they put the whole thing out in color. But the one that was the original unseen Star Trek pilot.
Right.
It came out on home video, and it was part in black and white and part in color.
Yep.
And that was, not that we had the episodes memorized anyway, but it was a great way to see what was in The Cage and what was in the Menagerie.
Well, I also think that what the Menagerie, the two-part Menagerie, did was create this idea of canon. Mm-hmm. That Star Trek, the idea that there is a canon to Star Trek, there is a continuity. Nobody would have ever cared about any of that. No one cared about continuity, about TV show continuity. Maybe Sherlock Holmes fans cared about continuity in the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or whatever. But as soon as they said, what you're seeing is from 11 years ago. Yeah. Oh, so Pike was captain of the Enterprise 11 years ago. Spock served under him 11 years ago, and there was changes in the set.
And the ship looks slightly different, but it's still the same ship.
The transporter room sounded different when you got beamed down. So suddenly there was Star Trek history, and there was Star Trek canon. And if you were a kid,
It became a legend.
it became a legend. And for somebody like myself watching it, I was like, I was beside myself, and all of my Star Trek love and interest had the idea of canon baked into it. And so as you watch, like they would mention the United Earth Space Probe Agency in the first season because they hadn't come up with the United Federation of Planets yet, you're like, in your mind, how does the United Earth Space Probe Agency relate to the Federation? Right. And there were all of these questions, and that was like real life. That was history. And that was what made Star Trek the Motion Picture so interesting, and all the books and the technical manuals and everything that came out. So in your mind, you had this tapestry of Star Trek that leapt beyond the shows.
Right. And if something jumped out at you as something that didn't quite fit, you just sort of, wrote it down as, well, that's just because I don't know what actually happened
Right,
yet.
you don't know yet. They haven't defined it. That's why the Best of Trek anthologies,
Right.
where people are reading it, trying to make sense.
What's
the
so
writing
incredible is this show from 1964, or from 65, from over 50 years ago, is still serving as the fodder now. I mean, whether you like Discovery or don't like it, I mean, they're still using Pike now #1, and I have to say that Rebecca Romijn looks fantastic as #1. I have high hopes for that character. I mean, I worked with Rebecca obviously on Librarians. I think she's terrific, and I think that it's amazing to me that this is still
It's still there.
the sun in which the whole universe orbits. That the Cage remains this sort of touchstone, and it was the same thing for the JJ. Of all the characters to bring back, it was Captain Pike. For an actor that people thought was dry and bland, and Jeffrey Hunter, boy, he sure. He's had now 2 actors with Anson Mount and Bruce Greenwood playing him. It's really remarkable. Like I said, whether you like it or not, that the Cage is still this touchstone for all these things.
Well, I actually just find it interesting that Roddenberry decided not only that they needed to recast the captain, but to recharacter. That it wasn't Shatner is now playing Pike. That
they didn't decide to recast. It was Jeffrey Hunter,
who said he couldn't.
whose
come
wife
back.
said,
But
"This show sucks. It's embarrassing."
Jeffrey is a movie star.
Jeffrey is a movie star. He's not available, and he was no longer under contract.
Kirk, as opposed to Shatner, is now just playing Pike. I think was a really interesting choice, which of course opened them up for the possibility later of doing the Menagerie.
And I think a lot of that came from Shatner himself. Shatner himself, after seeing the original pilot, wanted the main character to be more of that hero type.
But somebody else, not...
Yeah.
But she's right. They could have just easily, knowing that the pilot was never going to air,
Right.
just say, okay, you're now Captain Pike.
Right.
You know, we're recasting. I mean, how many times have we seen a different actor? You know, like in I Dream of Jeannie, or
Sure.
you know, Bewitched, where they recast the actor as Darren. You know, it was common of the era. But no, Shatner is a different character. He's Captain Kirk. He's not Captain Pike.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, it's interesting too that they made weird cosmetic changes, that like the little War of the Worlds weapon view screens that were
Right.
attached to everyone's stations. They didn't have to lose those. Those were actually kind of cool. But then they did lose those, and they upgraded the phasers, and they changed things around. And I kind of have always wondered, like, okay, I understand that you changed the cast, but and the color palette especially.
Well, because then you have Jerry Finnerman come on with the beginning with Corbinite Maneuver, you know, which obviously is so different than Ernie Haller, who's at the end of his career.
But it was also at a point where NBC wanted to sell color television sets.
Yes.
right.
And they said, we want you to have the most colorful thing you can have so that we can sell this to get more people to buy sets.
Yeah, but the cage is pretty colorful.
Not really.
I don't know.
Really.
I mean, I
It's-
think you
it's-
look at that matte painting, you look at the Green Girl.
Right.
Yeah, but it's compared to the rest of the season, it's pretty monotone.
Well, we should talk about Susan Oliver and the Green Girl because, of course, it's one of the most indelible and iconic images in all of Star Trek. Partially because every episode ended with that shot of her at the end.
Nice
but,
place you have here, Mr.
But
Pike.
you know, also for those of us who were men of a certain age, you know, growing up with the Green Girl, the Green Orion Slave Girl, you know, and what I find fascinating is that Susan Oliver was so ahead of her time. She was a character actor who was working a lot in television, but she was an aviator. She was one of the first female directors. It's so tragic. There's a wonderful little documentary called The Green Girl by George Pappy that I highly recommend because I can't do justice to her career. But she was really a truly remarkable woman. And, you know, all I really knew about her for a long time was, you know, that famous shot of her holding the sign, "Where are you, Oscar?" Because the cage had gone so far over schedule and over budget, and she had to move on to her. And she's like, Oscar Katz said he'd be there every day and that it would definitely finish on time and she'd be able to get out to go to her next thing. And here she is like a gazillion days later still working on this Fakakta pilot. And plus, you know, Gene completely lied to everyone saying that she was a great dancer when she had no idea how to dance. And then they brought Peggy Romans in to teach her, you know, how to do the Green Orion Slave Girl dance. And but, you know, that character where she plays the Green Orion Slave Girl and plays Avina and, you know, plays that you know, at the end, you know, it's just, she is so good in that show and grounds it with the, you know, because some of the other people they were looking at, like Jill St. John, all she would have been was a sex kitten.
Right.
You know, whereas Susan Oliver, there's so much.
Is a real woman.
And she plays so many different aspects of a woman. You know, she's the sex pot, Green Orion Slave Girl dancing. Then she's your apple pie, take her home to mom when she's riding horses with Pike. But then she's also the smart, intelligent, resolving herself to her fate when she's trying to explain to Pike, look, you just got to do what they tell you.
Right.
You know, and then at the end, even as a kid, I remember, like, I couldn't, you fell in love with Susan Oliver. To me, she was one of my ultimate, to this day, one of my favorite dream girls of all time. And then when you find out her fate
Yeah.
and the reveal
And what
of
she
her
has to say.
twisted body, and when she's finally, the illusion falls away and she's finally revealed that and she explains how the Telosians took her out of the wreckage, but they'd never seen a human being before.
Which I
So-
find a little dodgy because they
Yeah.
look just like Telosians, but with
Well,
smaller heads.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, but still, when you know, they kept her alive. They obviously kept her alive.
Absolutely.
But they didn't know how to put her back correctly. I mean,
It's
as
heartbreaking.
It was so heartbreaking, and it was one of those things where that was, I think, what Star Trek did best, especially for us as young people, young men, is that it subverted your expectations all the time.
Yeah.
And you learned something. Like I remember at the end when that episode, but also like in Arena, when you expect Kirk to do the Gorn in and kill the Gorn, and he doesn't.
Right.
He says, you know what, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I don't know what's going
It taught
on.
you ethics and
It-
morality.
Yeah, it taught you ethics and morality, and,
Captain Kirk
and it always
Well,
subverted
okay,
your
okay,
expectations. And when she's revealed at the end, as a child, that was really disturbing to me. But I also understood that it was sad. And the aliens, they tried.
They tried their
in
best.
They
that
just
moment-
didn't understand.
Yeah, in that
and they
moment,
weren't evil.
They
Yeah.
weren't evil. They really were trying, and they're portrayed as being. I mean, as kids, we called them the buttheads. The
Right.
Telosians
Yeah,
were
yeah,
buttheads.
yeah.
And you hated them. You hated them as a kid.
Federation
watching.
were the Beavises.
And then, but when you come out at the end and you realize that they are just trying to preserve what they are as people, and they're not evil, that was a revelation.
And they acted out of kindness. I mean, that's the thing. That's the thing that always struck me. I mean, there's a lot of things about that episode as a child that I found unsettling. A lot of like the makeup effects, honestly.
They're horrifying.
They're very horrifying. And
state of the art.
ending-
It's 1965.
Oh, no, 100%.
How amazing are those Telosian makeups, and the brilliance of casting these slight women,
Yeah.
as these. And then
giving
using-
them male
giving them male voices,
Or Commodore
which makes
Pike.
something. Oh, and then what about when Commodore Mendez disappears?
Right.
That's freaking creepy.
Yeah, I
He
mean, look,
was-
the whole thing is like, it's, as a child, that episode, those two episodes were weirdly kind of upsetting, but I think they were upsetting in a good way. And I think, if anything, what I kind of took away from that is what Rob was getting at, which is the idea of discovering at the end that that there is something about the villain and what the villain seems to be up to that is human and redeemable. That kindness can come from anywhere, and that makes them three-dimensional, and that makes them interesting and not just a threat. And that's stuck with me.
Not
And it
the
teaches
only
you
reason-
empathy, which is in such short supply now. And I feel like, we all learned empathy from Star Trek, to not fear other cultures, to care and invest and to learn from people
to
that
try
are
and
different than us.
Try and understand.
Yeah. And it has a great, look, it's like a Twilight Zone episode. The twist at the end is vintage Serling. And I was always blown away, and I never understood until I watched The Cage, how they had, the footage of Pike going away, watching and then going away with, staying
With
on the
Vina,
planet,
yeah.
how it worked so well in the menagerie until then I saw the actual end of The Cage. And again, how brilliantly they used that.
Yeah.
To give Pike back his body, where it was just the original ending of The Cage was they let Vina have this
And how
illusion.
wonderful it was in the menagerie for the Spock character to show the total devotion to his former captain is completely moving and
Starbase operations,
amazing.
Starbase operations, Starbase
And it made it a
operations.
story about Kirk and Spock.
Yes.
Yeah, totally. Ultimately, it was a story
completely
about Kirk
amazing.
and Spock, and Commodore Mendez, who remember when
Malachi Throne.
Malachi Throne. Remember when he came and met with us?
I mean, we were so excited. We wanted to use Malachi Throne to play this producer in Free Enterprise. The guy who ran the studio where the Robert character worked, and we wanted the original idea for the film was to populate it with Star Trek actors, and he was one of the first, and he came in to meet with us. And what did he tell us that was so crushing?
I'm too classy a guy to play a guy this sleazy, but my son is an actor.
I mean, it was so we were so excited to meet him, and he had such a great. It was such a great.
But he said, "I
erudite
came here to
presence."
meet with you," and we're like, "Why? If you were just going to turn that on?" I wanted to meet the guys who wrote the script.
Yeah, he loved the script.
Yeah.
But he just wouldn't play a sleazy
And
B
it's
movie
so
producer.
funny in retrospect because you think about all these Star Trek actors. Like, remember we wanted Barbara Luna from Mirror Mirror to play Marlena because it was clearly inspired by her character, and we ended up casting Deborah von Valkenburg from The Warriors and Streets of Fire. But now you see Barbara Luna, she's like, my agent never told me. I never knew. I would have done it in a heartbeat. It's one of the great disappointments of my career that I didn't get to do that role. I mean, it's so.
Mine too.
Well, Endeavor was great, but it would have been so great to have Shatner and Barbara Luna together on screen, after all those years. So, the interesting trivia about the Green Girl, of course, is Majel tells that familiar story about how they kept color correcting the Green Girl so she would come back in dailies normal, but before that.
But the funny thing is, it wasn't footage of Susan Oliver. It was footage of Majel with the green makeup on. And it kept coming back from the lab completely pink, just like regular flesh tones. And apparently this happened 2 or 3 more times. And finally, they called the lab up. What the hell is going on? Where are we using the wrong? They tried various different shades of green to see if it would work, but they figured that it just wasn't registering on the film stock for some reason. But they called the lab up and saying, "Oh, well, we thought you were just doing something really wrong, and so we were correcting that for you." And so finally, they got green that looked good on screen.
But originally she was supposed to be yellow.
Well, I interestingly have a memo from Roddenberry.
The planet of the jaundice people.
It says, here's a November 24th, 1964, to Fred Phillips, head of the makeup department, from Gene Roddenberry. Suggest we consider making up our slaves in Orion scenes with the same yellow makeup as used for Leonard Nimoy. Also, are we still considering black-type wigs here? What would it cost us in makeup time and trouble if we used some of our extra false ears on the Orion slaves in this scene? Gene Roddenberry. So at every moment he was trying to cut corners and try and figure out what things were looking like.
You know, and we were talking about how great Susan Oliver was in that role, and it's funny because if you look at any of the other actresses who played Grant, whether it be Yvonne Craig in Whom Gods Destroy, Rachel Nichols in the Star Trek movie, Enterprise had a few, none of them ever had that ineffable quality that Susan Oliver had.
No.
You know, never came close. You know, you could paint a sexy girl green, as we did at Rob's bachelor party, and it's great. Right. But
it was great.
but it's not. It lacks something that Susan Oliver brought, because it's not just about being a sexy green girl. It's about a quality.
There's also a thing that Gene Roddenberry brought, and I don't think we can lose sight of that, in that she was never, in any of those scenes, she was never just the sexy green girl.
An object, right.
Right. She, and she wasn't just that character. That character was a representation. I mean, she's like, Robert Downey Jr. in Tropic Thunder. It's like, she's a dude.
Wow, that's a stretch.
Playing another dude. Like, the character has layers. It's a role upon a role upon a role.
Yeah.
And, what must be going through Susan Oliver's mind has got to be like what all of those things that are informing that performance. So if you're just playing, the Orion green girl, you're never going to get what Susan Oliver brought to it.
That's one of the things that I am overly uptight about modern Star Trek, is that these sort of symbols that we've seen over and over again of, for example, the green girl or guys in red shirts, things like that. These are things that are supposedly known in the vast world as being Star Trek, but they don't know what they actually mean. They know the surface of it. They know that, there's a sexy green woman there that Kirk has sex with, or something like that.
Without any understanding
that that's not it at all.
It's an irony.
Well,
it's a terrible irony if you think about it, because she's this beautiful green girl. Right? She is presented as this incredible sex symbol, right? And as you said, we see her in the end titles all the time, and so she sticks in our minds, and we associate that image. But the truth of her that is revealed at the end, couldn't be farther away from that image that's being projected. So there's a deep irony.
Well, it's rooted in story, because of course it goes back to the conversation with the Doctor where he's saying, maybe I, don't want to be a starship captain at all, and he's saying, maybe you want you're going to be a trader in a green Orion animal women, and
the funny thing is that in the Cage version, the green woman is the predator.
Yes, very
she
much so.
She is the sexual predator of men.
Yes, which is wonderful, because it's not this kind of 60s sexist, she is absolutely the predator preying on his insecurities, and he ultimately, he rebuffs her. Yeah. So it's this thing that's considered because now I remember they rebranded the toys. They didn't want to call them slave women.
Right.
Because that was not politically incorrect. It fails to understand exactly what that character is. And again, the fact is, this is an important part of Star Trek storytelling, because these are women that have been enslaved by the Regillians and being sold as property. It's a story about slavery. It's not some kind of sexist or
it's not a space brothel.
It's, right? Yeah, it's not being used as to be like some kind of titillating at all. And so it's like, they're animal women. We're not going to call them slave girls anymore.
Well, 50
slave
years,
women.
50 plus years on, so much of Star Trek has been that it's been infantilized. It's been turned into the people's understanding, the public at large's understanding of all of this stuff is so superficial. And I think that's really, especially in the last decade of Star Trek has been, we have to make it have more mass appeal.
It's been homogenized.
It's been homogenized, and they've taken away all of the thoughtful literary elements that used to be inherent in the show,
Right.
and it's been sort of stripped out. And again, it goes back to the writing. I think the people, even the actors and the actresses, were also coming out of World War II, coming out of, you had people that were Depression era that went into World War II, and then the rise of the American middle class and the explosion of education and the GI Bill, and there was so much going on in America that I think they just had more of a literary background. Just the man on the street had more of a literary background, or more of an understanding of what American life meant, as opposed to where we're at now.
Well, people were more interested in other people rather than just self-aggrandizement about themselves. And this is what I did today. This is what I wore today. This is what I ate today. Instagram and all that. It was about a real interest in what other people were doing. It was about seeing the world and reading about all these incredible places. And Star Trek took you to these. And we used to talk about this how when we would travel with Free Enterprise, when we were in Spain, when we were in France, the message of Star Trek was to boldly go. And obviously, we're not going to go into space unless we have $1 million for a Virgin Galactic flight. So, see the world, explore other cultures. That's what Star Trek taught us, not to stay in your parents' basement behind a computer.
Again, coming out of the promise of Kennedy's Camelot era of American government, and he made the promise of going to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And you had a real, I think, sense of optimism about the world. I mean, we were not involved in Indochina the way we were later on in the decade.
Right.
So I think that all of this was born out of that there was a hopefulness.
And Star Trek really wrestled with, obviously, the Indochina-Vietnam dilemma, because you see it in Private Little War, you see it, and we'll talk about that. And also, of course, I did want to talk about how much the Cage was an influence on Emissary, the Deep Space Nine pilot, which is probably one of the other great Star Trek pilots.
Yep.
But I kind of feel like at this point maybe we should leave that for another episode, because the Voyager and the Enterprise pilots are also worthy of revisiting. I guess Discovery as well, but specifically the Deep Space Nine pilot, because of its mix of sort of a cerebral and spirituality, and using the metaphor of the LA riots to tell a story of basically people coming together to triumph over adversity and potentially sort of racism and xenophobia. It's a very interesting pilot, and again, I think through the lens of today is even perhaps more relevant.
I never thought of it until you just mentioned it right now, but Sisko and the pilot is also the way Pike was coming off of what happened on Rigel. Sisko's coming off of what happened on the Saratoga with the Battle of Wolf 359. It's
incredibly emotional.
And it goes back to what you said about the universe. Here they're using this event from Next Generation, this iconic event of the Battle of Wolf 359, which is now being utilized as part of creating, this wider canon, this huge tapestry that is Star Trek. And when people dismiss legitimate concerns, people say, "Oh, they're reinventing canon." They're and say, "Oh, well, you're just fans from the '60s. Get over it." You old. Star Trek has built this beautiful house. This beautiful Art Deco house. And if suddenly you turn it into a Spanish colonial, it's like, it doesn't go together. It's like peanut butter and my chocolate.
That actually does go together.
Oh, well, it's like fire and oil and water. But the point being, it's a completely different architectural style, will mess up a beautiful house. If you have a craftsman house and suddenly, you're doing... a Bauhaus, it's just not gonna work. So I think it's relevant, and Rob makes this point about this incredible universe and that the shared universe. I mean, why does Marvel work so well? Because it respects everything that's come before, rather than reinventing it and starting from scratch. That's why DC doesn't work. Because it's not cohesive.
And I think it's really interesting that, and we've seen examples of how to use canonical Trek, like, for instance, the Enterprise appearing in Troubles and Tribulations in, 96? Mm-hmm. We saw how that worked, and it was amazing. 30 years on, and it works. And yet now they can't show the Enterprise without changing it and giving it some visual update for whatever reason I still don't understand.
Well, it's a legal thing, yeah.
Let's focus on the good and just say
that
we love the Cage.
Yeah. This podcast is about celebrating what we love.
Celebrate the love.
I agree, but it's interesting that this episode, The Cage, is just as relevant. You could watch it today, over 50 years later, and still find it just as enjoyable and interesting, and take away as much away from it as you can as when it was first made.
Because Star Trek will always date. You know, whatever is contemporary now is going to be ancient history tomorrow. And so, you know, it's the stories that have to stand up. And The Cage stands up as well today as it ever did. Whereas, you know, I remember when Next Generation came out, oh, they would talk styrofoam rocks and cardboard sets. Now look how dated Next Generation looks like. Right. I would argue the Next Generation is dated worse than the original show.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
and, you know, I think the reason why The Cage ultimately stands up and why a pilot stands up versus you go, well, okay, is because it is this complete beginning, middle, and end story about Captain Christopher Pike and how he wrestled with loss and, you know, how he was tempted to succumb to that and to live inside of his own fantasies of a different kind of life, but ultimately realized that he had to be the captain of the Enterprise because ultimately that's who he was, you know, warts and all, difficulties and all, that's who he had to be. And that was the launch into the show. And that's why it was so great. And that's why I think it worked so well when it became the Menagerie, because ultimately the show could go back to that.
Yep.
Well, The Cage is where Star Trek began, but it's where our podcast ends for today. This was a really fascinating look back at the beginning of Star Trek, and I'm glad we took the time to look back, and I think we will have to revisit some of these other Star Trek pilots in future episodes. But on behalf of Robert Meyer Burnett, Ashley Miller, Darren Doctor, and myself, Mark A. Altman, I'd like to thank you for joining us for another episode of Inglorious Treksperts. And one day I'll say it right. Inglorious Treksperts. And I hope you'll follow us on social media. You can find Rob at...
Find me on Twitter at BurnettRM. Find me on Instagram at RMBurnett. Or find me, sign up to The Burnett Work on YouTube and see my new show, Robservations.
And Ashley?
You can find me on Twitter at Ashmaster0. And the second season of Lore is available on Amazon Prime.
Yeah. And find me at Darren Doc with 1 R on Twitter.
You can find all of us at Inglorious Treksperts on Twitter, and you can find me at Mark A. Altman on Twitter and Instagram. If you look for me on Friendster, you won't have much luck, but you should check out The Cage, which is about as old. Anyway, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. You can pick up my book, The 50-Year Mission, wherever books are sold, and we look forward to joining you again very soon. Engage.
Sweetheart, all my prayers are for you. Good night, sweetheart, I'll be watching all